In the heart of the fiercest snowstorm Coldwater had ever seen, the entire town lay buried beneath white silence. Every phone, every radio, every satellite link had gone dead, leaving even Sheriff Elena Ward powerless before the storm's wrath. But when a young boy's breathing began to fade, she made a desperate choice. Their last hope rested with a man everyone feared and tried to forget. Jonah Merrick, a reclusive veteran who lived alone beneath the shattered dome of an abandoned observatory. Why would she trust the outcast no one dared to speak to? Because hidden within those frozen walls, with only his loyal German shepherd Kaiser by his side, lay a signal strong enough to pierce the silence of heaven itself. Please support us by subscribing to the channel. The town of Coldwater lay beneath a constant veil of frost, a place where winter never truly left. The wind moved through the narrow streets like an old spirit, rattling tin roofs and carrying the metallic scent of snow that had long forgotten how to melt. The horizon was always pale, as if the sun itself hesitated to look too closely. On the highest ridge overlooking this frozen settlement stood an abandoned observatory. Its once silver dome now a patchwork of rust and ice, its telescope blind to the heavens it once adored. Inside that dome lived a man most townsfolk only spoke of in whispers. His name was Jonah Merrick, 71 years old, a veteran who had outlived his wars but not the echoes they left behind. Tall and lean, with the sinewy endurance of a man who had spent half his life outdoors, Jonah carried himself like a soldier still waiting for orders that would never come. His hair, once black as the rifle barrels he'd polished in youth, was now the dull gray of storm clouds. A jagged scar ran from his left temple to the curve of his cheek, the last gift from a mortar blast in Kandahar more than 4 decades ago. He rarely spoke of it. When asked, his eyes would simply drift toward the horizon, where memory and silence met. Jonah's face was weathered, lined with the stubborn discipline of someone who refused to yield. Yet behind that granite exterior lingered a quiet sadness. A man who knew both the sound of gunfire and the ache of being forgotten by the peace he fought for. His only companion was Kaiser, a 7-year-old German shepherd with a coat the color of smoke and snow mixed together, thick enough to repel the worst of the mountain wind. Kaiser's eyes were amber, sharp, yet patient, filled with the kind of intelligence that could read his master's moods better than words ever could. He had been trained once for military search work, though Jonah never explained how the dog had come to him. Some said he'd rescued Kaiser from an abandoned kennel during a wildfire. Others claimed the dog had simply appeared one night, drawn to the lonely light of the dome. Whatever the truth, man and dog had become one soul split in 2 bodies, each the other's last remaining duty. Every morning before the frostlight broke, Jonah would descend the spiral iron stairs to the observatory's main floor, where old equipment sat in neat, disciplined rows. Vacuum tubes, coils, hand-labeled resistors stored in jars once meant for peaches. The air always smelled faintly of solder and oil, the perfume of his solitude. He had rebuilt the generator himself, a bulky relic from the 80s, its rhythmic thrum his only proof that life still pulsed in this forgotten structure. He would brew his coffee black and bitter, pour half into a chipped metal mug, and set the rest in a small bowl for Kaiser, who lapped at it contentedly as if it were holy water. Together they would listen, to the wind, to the sighing of the dome's rusted joints, and to the static whispering from Jonah's collection of restored shortwave radios. To the people down in Coldwater, that static was the sound of madness. They called Jonah the ghost in the dome, and his dog the wolf. Children dared one another to climb the ridge at night and touch the observatory's frozen door. Grown men warned their wives not to waste pity on the recluse who watched stars that no longer shone. But Jonah never minded their rumors. Once, years ago, when a group of hunters had wandered too close and shouted slurs from the tree line, he had merely stood at his window and saluted them with his coffee mug. The gesture confused them more than anger would have. After that, the town's curiosity settled into avoidance, the kind that pretends indifference but secretly fears what it doesn't understand. Jonah's days were structured with the same precision that had governed his years in uniform. He kept a handwritten log of the weather, noted the changes in barometric pressure, and charted radio frequencies like constellations in invisible space. At night, when the aurora flared across the horizon, he would tilt back the cracked lens of the old telescope and watch its reflection ripple across Kaiser's eyes. Those were the moments he almost felt at peace, when the universe seemed to hum in harmony with the faint static in his headphones. But even peace has its ghosts. Sometimes, when the wind struck the dome just right, the vibration in the metal triggered memories Jonah could not silence. He would hear again the overlapping voices of his squad over radio static, young men calling for extraction, for air support, for mothers. The crack of a failing transmission could still quicken his pulse. Kaiser sensed these moments before they arrived. He would rise from his mat, press his head against Jonah's knee, and ground him back in the present. Then the old soldier would exhale, take off his headset, and murmur, "Still here, boy. Just noise." Below, in the heart of the valley, the people of Coldwater prepared for another storm. Sheriff Elena Ward, a woman in her late 40s with a practical build and a streak of gray through her black braid, made her rounds in a battered, snow-covered SUV. She was respected, not for charm, but for her calm. A necessary trait in a place where panic could freeze faster than water. She had come from the city after a divorce that had left her wary but not bitter, and she managed the town with the same quiet authority Jonah used to manage his machines. Though she seldom admitted it, she admired the old man on the hill. There was something in his unyielding independence that mirrored her own need to prove she could survive without anyone's permission. Elena was one of the few who didn't mock Jonah. When she drove past the road leading to the observatory, she would sometimes see a faint light flickering through the trees, steady, methodical, reassuring in its way. "He's up there, again," she would tell herself, as though his presence alone meant the town was somehow being watched over. That evening, as the first tendrils of the coming blizzard began to snake through the valley, Jonah sat before his largest transceiver. The generator hummed steadily, the soft amber glow of the vacuum tubes painting warm halos on his lined face. Kaiser lay beside him, head on pause, breathing slow and even. Jonah turned the tuning dial, chasing distant voices. He caught fragments, a fisherman in Alaska reporting high winds, a hobbyist in Argentina complaining of interference, and somewhere, faintly, a station broadcasting an old country song. He smiled at the static-filled melody. "Not bad, eh, boy?" Kaiser's ear twitched in agreement. When the signal faded, Jonah adjusted the antenna feed and caught a faint, rhythmic pulse, barely audible, like the heartbeat of the world itself. He scribbled a note in his logbook, then reached for his coffee, now gone cold. Through the cracked glass window above his desk, snow had begun to fall. Slow, deliberate, endless. He stood, stretching stiff joints, and walked to the viewing platform. From there he could see the town below, its streetlights glowing dim beneath the growing curtain of white. For a moment he felt utterly apart from it all, like a man watching history from another planet. Kaiser joined him at the window, tail swishing softly against Jonah's leg. "Looks like another long one," Jonah murmured. "We'll ride it out, same as always." The dog's amber eyes reflected the faint light from the valley, steady and unafraid. Jonah rested a hand on his companion's head, the silence between them thick but comforting. Then, in the distance, thunder rolled, a rare, low rumble that echoed off the frozen hills like artillery from a forgotten war. Jonah's gaze lingered on the horizon, where the storm gathered its strength. Something in the air felt different this time, charged, expectant, as though the sky itself was waiting for a signal. Back in town, Sheriff Ward looked up from her patrol car at the same rolling clouds. She felt the first static spark along her fingertips as she reached for the radio mic, and the device hissed, "Dead." "Not tonight," she whispered, unaware that far above, under the rusted dome, another signal had just been born. Jonah returned to his bench, unaware that the faint, rhythmic pulse he'd logged minutes earlier was the first sign of the blizzard that would soon bury Coldwater. He leaned back in his chair, Kaiser curling at his feet, and let the hum of the generator lull him into a rare, uneasy peace. Outside, the snow thickened, swallowing the dome in silence. The man and his dog, the outcasts of the hill, remained the only light left burning against the storm to come. The morning after the first flakes began to fall, Coldwater appeared deceptively calm beneath a heavy ceiling of gray. The air was sharp and metallic, the kind that carried the promise of something worse. Inside the town hall, Mayor Clive Porter stood before a window fogged with his own breath. At 58, he had the practiced poise of a man who had never allowed himself to age poorly. His silver hair was combed neatly back, his eyes a piercing blue that reflected calculation more than warmth. Once a realtor who sold impossible dreams, Clive had reinvented himself as a visionary politician after bankruptcy had humbled him a decade earlier. But humiliation had not softened him. It had hardened him into a man who believed progress must come at any cost. He now clutched a folder stamped with the town seal, a petition demanding the demolition of Jonah Merrick's Observatory to make way for a ski resort. Across from him sat Rick Dalton, the owner of Dalton's Lumber and Hardware. Rick was 42, barrel-chested, with forearms thick as timber and a beard the color of old rust. His flannel shirt was rolled to the elbows, exposing scars from years of work and one long burn that ran along his wrist, a reminder of the fire that had devoured his warehouse 2 winters ago. That loss had turned his pride into bitterness and his skepticism into a weapon. "So this is it?" Rick asked, his gravelly voice carrying the weight of discontent. "We're finally moving that old hermit off the hill?" Clive smiled with political ease. "We're protecting the town," he said smoothly. "The observatory's unsafe. The man's a hazard. This petition is a step toward progress." Rick let out a short, humorless laugh. "Progress, huh? You mean investors?" The mayor's smile tightened. "Coldwater's dying, Rick. We both know it. That dome isn't history. It's dead weight. Fear gets things done faster than sentiment." He handed Rick a copy of the petition. The paper looked fragile, yet it might as well have been a weapon. By noon, those words had spread like wildfire through the town's veins. Posters appeared on windows. "Keep Coldwater safe. Remove the abandoned observatory." At Dalton's Hardware, Rick passed out flyers with a grin that didn't quite reach his eyes. "You ever seen that mutt of his?" he said to 2 customers buying shovels. "Looks more wolf than dog. Heard he tore a man's arm open once." It was a lie, but in small towns, a good story always outruns the truth. Soon, whispers filled the aisles of McCready's diner, the grocery, the post office. The old man on the hill became the ghost everyone loved to fear. That afternoon, Sheriff Elena Ward stepped into Rick's store to escape the wind. She was a tall woman in her 40s, her build strong but graceful beneath her parka. A streak of gray cut through her black braid, and her copper-toned skin held the weather's bite like a medal of endurance. Her presence carried quiet authority, the kind that could silence a room without raising her voice. "Afternoon, Rick," she greeted, warming her gloved hands by the small stove. Rick leaned on the counter, eyes gleaming with challenge. "Afternoon, Sheriff. You signed that petition yet?" "No," Elena replied flatly. "Jonah Merrick's done nothing wrong. He pays taxes, keeps to himself. Being strange isn't a crime." Rick snorted. "Keeping to yourself ain't the same as being safe. That place looks ready to cave in. What if a kid goes exploring and falls through the floor?" Elena's expression didn't change. "Then maybe parents should teach their kids to read a no trespassing sign." The room fell silent. The customers pretended to browse nails and rope. Rick's jaw clenched, but he said nothing more. Elena turned, gave him a calm nod, and left. Outside, the wind was starting to wail through the alleys, carrying snow that stung the eyes. By dusk, the storm was building momentum. The air itself seemed to hum. People hurried home, heads bowed, scarves pulled tight. Inside McCready's diner, the smell of burnt coffee hung thick while locals murmured about the weather. The mayor entered in his elegant gray coat, brushing snow from his shoulders like it was dust. "Evening, folks," he said with a smile that could sell warmth to an iceberg. "Just another storm. Nothing to worry about. Great for the resort season, if you ask me." From behind the counter, Sadie Mullins, a young waitress with freckles and chestnut hair tied in a messy bun, poured refills with trembling hands. She was 22 and kind-hearted, the sort who apologized even when it wasn't her fault. "Feels worse than usual," she said softly. Clive chuckled, patting her shoulder. "You just need thicker socks, my dear." Then he left, stepping back into the wind that swallowed his words whole. The temperature plummeted. Snow no longer fell. It charged sideways, driven by gusts that screamed against rooftops. Rick stood at his shop window later that night, holding a cup of coffee gone lukewarm. The storm's breath rattled the glass. "Pour a cup outside," he muttered, amused. "And it'd freeze before it hit the ground?" He laughed, but the sound was hollow. Moments later, the lights flickered, dimmed, and died. The heater coughed once, then silence. Rick froze, staring into the dark, realizing his joke had become prophecy. Across town, Sheriff Ward sat in her office, trying to raise the county dispatch. The radio spat only static. "Station 1 to county. Do you read?" Nothing. Just the whisper of interference. She leaned back, eyes narrowing toward Frost Hill. Somewhere beyond that wall of white, she knew Jonah Merrick's light still burned. And though she didn't yet understand why, something deep inside told her that the man everyone mocked might soon be the one who would save them all. High above the valley, inside the observatory, Jonah sat before his equipment as the storm howled around him. The walls shuddered, but the dome held strong. He adjusted a dial, frowning at the strange frequency pulsing through the static, a rhythm too deliberate to be random. Kaiser lifted his head, ears perked, his amber eyes following Jonah's every movement. "You feel that, boy?" Jonah murmured. "The air's changing." He looked toward the window, where the snow had swallowed the world. The old soldier's voice lowered, almost a whisper. "That's no ordinary storm." Outside, the observatory vanished under the fury of the blizzard, and Coldwater disappeared with it. Its laughter, its bravado, its fragile confidence buried beneath the merciless white silence of the century's storm. The world of Coldwater had gone dark. The power lines had surrendered first, snapping under the weight of the ice like old bones. Then the phone signals faded, swallowed whole by the storm that now roared without mercy. Even the satellites, those distant, blinking guardians of modern life, had gone silent above the gray void. The town was cut off, wrapped in a tomb of snow and static. Down on Elm Street, the Hale residence sat half-buried, its roof bent under the heavy drifts. Inside, the small living room flickered with the pale light of 3 struggling candles. Dr. Miriam Hale moved between the sofa and the kitchen counter like a ghost of herself. She was in her late 30s, tall and slender, with tired eyes the color of dark honey and hair once auburn, but now streaked with gray at the temples. Her hands were strong, surgeon's hands, but they trembled as she held a half-empty inhaler between her fingers. Miriam had once been the kind of woman who radiated control, whether in her small clinic or at PTA meetings, but tonight she was nothing more than a mother drowning in helplessness. On the sofa lay her son, Noah, a thin 9-year-old boy with freckles dusting his pale cheeks and a mop of sandy blonde hair that stuck to his damp forehead. Each breath he took came out as a wheeze, shallow and uneven, his chest rising and falling like a bird's wing caught in a snare. "Mom," he whispered, his voice small, brittle. "It hurts to breathe." Miriam knelt beside him, her voice trembling despite her effort to sound calm. "I know, sweetheart. Just stay still, okay? Try to take slow breaths." She shook the inhaler and pressed it to his lips, but the plastic chamber hissed dry, empty. Her heart sank. She turned toward the dark window, snow hammering against it like 1,000 small fists. The clinic, with its stash of bronchodilators and oxygen tanks, was barely a quarter-mile away, but the road was gone, buried under 6 feet of snow. She was a doctor surrounded by knowledge, but every ounce of it was useless without the tools to save her son. A gust slammed into the wall so hard that the glass quivered. The sound made Miriam flinch. It reminded her of a night 10 years ago in the ER, when a tornado had ripped through the next county. She had treated children crushed under debris. That same sound, the world groaning in protest, had followed her ever since. Tonight, it returned not outside, but within. Noah coughed violently, his small body curling in pain. Miriam's control broke. She wrapped him in blankets, whispering half prayers, half instructions. "Just hold on, baby, please, just hold on." Across the valley, at the summit of Frost Hill, the wind screamed against the steel walls of the old observatory. Inside, Jonah Merrick sat in the dim amber glow of his workbench lamps, adjusting the dials of his primary transceiver. The generator behind him rumbled steadily, its sound rhythmic and dependable like a giant's heartbeat. He had checked every line twice that morning, the Yagi antenna secured on the roof, the grounding cables, the backup fuel lines, all tight and steady. Now, as the blizzard raged, his focus narrowed to the frequency meters before him. Static filled the room, rising and falling in waves that reminded him of ocean surf or gunfire. For a moment the years fell away, and he was no longer 71 in a frozen observatory. He was 20 again, crouched in a sandbag bunker half a world away, his hands gripping a field radio while mortars screamed overhead. The static then had been a chorus of ghosts, the desperate voices of soldiers fading into the ether. He could almost smell the diesel fumes, the burnt cordite, the sweat and iron of fear. The radio in front of him seemed to flicker, and his pulse quickened. "Miller, you copy? Albany, come in." The memory hit him with the precision of a bullet. Jonah blinked hard. His hand trembled toward the tuning knob, but then something warm pressed against his knee. He looked down. Kaiser was there, steady, solid, his head resting against Jonah's leg. The dog's amber eyes stared up with quiet authority, as if to say, "You're here, not there." Jonah exhaled slowly, his breath visible in the cold air. "Good boy," he murmured, running a calloused hand through Kaiser's thick coat, the gray fur glinting like smoke in the lamplight. "Still here?" The sound of the wind outside began to lose its grip on him. He turned back to the equipment, tuning the transceiver through dead channels. Static, then, faintly, a voice. It was garbled, distant, but undeniably human. Jonah leaned closer. "Emergency. Asthma. Child. Coldwater. Anyone copy?" He froze. His fingers tightened around the microphone. "This is Observatory Station 1 on Frost Hill," he said clearly, his old military cadence snapping into place. "I read you faintly. Identify yourself." The voice faded, swallowed by interference, leaving only the hiss. Jonah adjusted the gain, his eyes darting across the signal scope. Nothing. "Come on," he muttered. "Don't die on me now." He struck the side of the receiver with his open palm, a habit born from decades of stubborn machinery, and the static cleared for half a second. Enough for him to catch the last fragment. "Help. Boy, can't breathe." He rose from his chair so fast that the stool toppled over. Kaiser barked once, startled. Jonah stared at the receiver, his heartbeat thudding in his ears. Someone in town had managed to reach the frequency. Barely. But how? He checked the channel. It wasn't a government band. It was civilian, improvised. Probably a small handheld transceiver powered by car batteries. Whoever it was, they were desperate. Jonah grabbed his field log and began noting coordinates, adjusting the triangulation settings on his signal scope. He could pinpoint the source roughly, somewhere southeast, near the River Road. "That's Elm Street," he murmured. Kaiser followed him to the narrow window. Outside, there was nothing but a wall of white. The snow was relentless, rising past the observatory's lower windows, the world reduced to a blur of motion. Jonah clenched his jaw. "If the power's out down there, the clinic's dead too," he said. His voice carried a tone he hadn't heard in himself for years. Purpose. He moved back to the console and keyed the transmitter. "To anyone broadcasting on this frequency, this is Frost Hill Station. I received your signal. Hold tight. I'm working on contact. Over." He waited. Silence. Only the wind answered. Jonah adjusted the signal booster, rerouting power from his backup heater to strengthen the broadcast. The temperature in the observatory dropped almost immediately. Frost began to creep across the inside of the dome, forming delicate crystalline veins along the steel ribs. Kaiser shifted closer to him, his breath fogging the air. Jonah reached down, rubbed his ear. "We'll get them through it, boy. We've seen worse, haven't we?" He turned once more to the generator, the machine that had become his lifeline. It was old military stock, olive drab and built like a tank. Jonah crouched beside it, checking the oil gauge, adjusting the fuel flow. The steady thrum comforted him. He remembered teaching young recruits how to fix power units under fire, telling them that noise was good, silence was death. "As long as she growls, we're alive," he murmured. The radio hissed again. Jonah hurried back to the bench. A new voice broke through, faint but urgent. "This is Sheriff Ward. Anyone at the observatory to come in." Jonah grabbed the mic. "Sheriff, this is Merrick. I hear you." Relief washed over her voice, distorted but clear enough. "We've got a medical emergency. Child's critical. All routes blocked. You're the only one with power." Jonah's hands moved automatically. "Copy that. Patch me their coordinates. I'll raise a relay to the state emergency frequency." He glanced at Kaiser. The dog's ears perked, alert. The soldier in Jonah, the part buried under years of solitude, snapped awake. He set to work rerouting his antenna to align with the upper band. His breath fogged the glass, his movements precise, mechanical, determined. Outside, the wind screamed through the antenna masts, the cables thrumming like strings of an otherworldly instrument. The sound was eerie, almost musical. Jonah paused, listening. It reminded him of something from long ago, the low hum of radio chatter between dying stations, the last fragments of men calling out to anyone who would listen. The frequency of souls, one of his old comrades had once called it. Tonight, that phrase no longer felt poetic. It felt literal. Somewhere in the darkness, people were calling again. He keyed the transmitter one final time. "Coldwater, this is Frost Hill. I've got you. Hold your line." And as the observatory lights flickered under the weight of the storm, Jonah Merrick and his loyal companion Kaiser became the only signal still alive in a town swallowed by silence. The storm had grown into something unearthly, a living wall of white that swallowed everything from sound to distance. From the window of her snow-covered patrol vehicle, Sheriff Elena Ward could barely make out the hood ornament trembling under a crust of ice. The wipers struggled uselessly, squealing across glass that had turned to frost. Her hands, wrapped in thick black gloves, gripped the steering wheel until her knuckles ached. The snowplow she had commandeered from the maintenance yard had gotten her halfway up Frost Hill before dying. Its engine choked by the cold, its treads trapped in drifts that rose taller than a man. She'd tried to dig it out, but the wind tore at her face and turned her breath to ice before it left her lips. Now, with the plow angled uselessly into the slope, she sat in the driver's seat, the radio in her lap emitting nothing but static. For the first time that night, she felt small. Elena Ward was not a woman easily cowed by nature. At 47, she'd weathered her share of chaos, domestic disputes that turned violent, flash floods, an entire forest fire that once surrounded her cruiser before the rains came. She had learned that fear, like weather, could be endured if you stood still long enough. But this storm wasn't something to endure. It was something alive. Coldwater Station to Frost Hill. She tried again into the mic, her voice cracking from the cold. "Jonah, do you copy? Merrick, come in." Only a hiss answered. She glanced at the dimming fuel gauge and muttered, "Damn it." She was running out of both fuel and options. Somewhere in the back of her mind, she could still hear the wheezing breath of Noah Hale over the radio. "It hurts to breathe," and Dr. Hale's trembling voice pleading for help. That sound stayed with her more than any scream ever had. She couldn't let it end here. High above her, inside the rust-streaked dome of the observatory, Jonah Merrick leaned over his workbench, tracing the latest readings on his radioscope. The storm's intensity was beginning to drown even the strongest signals. Static waves rolled through his headphones like the surf of a dying sea. But through the blur, he caught something. A faint, rhythmic pulse of power not far from his hill. He frowned, recognizing the pattern of a vehicle engine struggling, starting, then cutting out. Diesel. Sheriff Ward. He stood abruptly, his old knees creaking. Kaiser, who had been dozing by the generator, lifted his head, amber eyes sharp. Jonah crossed to the frost-glazed window and squinted into the storm. There, in the sea of white, he saw it. A faint beam of yellow light sweeping in slow arcs, fading in and out of the blizzard's curtain. It was the sheriff's plow, trapped. Jonah didn't waste time. He grabbed a waterproof note canister, an old message tube from his service days, and pulled a pencil stub from behind his ear. His handwriting, still neat despite the tremor in his hand, scratched across the paper. Engine stalled. "Stay put. Help coming." JM. He rolled the note, slipped it into the tube, and snapped it shut. Then he crouched beside Kaiser and fastened the canister to the leather strap of the dog's collar. Kaiser stood perfectly still, tail twitching once. "Find Sheriff," Jonah said softly, his voice low but commanding. "You remember the smell? Diesel, oil, and fear. Follow it." The dog tilted his head, as if acknowledging the order, then turned toward the steel door. Jonah pulled it open, and the storm screamed in like a living thing. For a moment, the gale threatened to throw him off balance. He leaned into it, steadying himself, and gave the final order. "Go." Kaiser vanished into the storm like a bullet disappearing into smoke. Jonah watched until the shadow of his companion melted into the white expanse. Then he shut the door and leaned against it, exhaling a single word to no one but the storm. "Godspeed." Outside, the world had lost all meaning of direction. There was no horizon, no sky, only motion. Snow struck Kaiser's fur in sheets, freezing instantly against the black and tan coat. He moved low to the ground, instinct guiding him when sight failed. The scent of diesel hung faintly in the air, a thread of humanity amid the sterile cold. He followed it, weaving through drifts that rose like dunes, his paws crunching into snow crust that cracked like glass. The wind howled so loudly it sounded like thunder trapped in the clouds. Twice, Kaiser paused, lifting his nose to test the air. The smell came and went, fickle as memory. He adjusted, veering right, then left, his body slicing through the storm's chaos with the precision of instinct honed through trust. Halfway down the slope, his paw struck something buried, a half-exposed glove half frozen into the snow. He sniffed it, then clamped his jaws gently around it, carrying it forward like a token. If Jonah were watching, he might have smiled. The dog had always had a strange sense of humor, collecting small evidences on every mission as if to prove he'd done his job. The glove dangled from his mouth as he pressed onward, his tail wagging once despite the brutal cold. Far below, in the buried snowplow, Sheriff Ward fought to keep her eyes open. The cold was creeping in fast, gnawing at her fingertips. She tried the ignition again. The engine coughed but didn't catch. She cursed under her breath and leaned back, closing her eyes for just a second. That second stretched too long. A faint sound cut through the storm, a low, sharp bark. She blinked, her breath fogging the window. Another bark, closer this time. Then, from the white void ahead of her, a dark shape emerged. At first she thought it was a wolf. Then the shape resolved. A German shepherd, fur rimed with frost, eyes gleaming gold in her headlights. He approached the vehicle steadily, snow swirling around him like ghosts bowing in deference. "Kaiser?" She whispered, startled. The dog barked again, muffled by the storm, and pressed his paws against the driver's door, whining. Elena fumbled to unlock it and cracked it open just enough for the wind to slice in. The dog thrust his muzzle through, dropping something cold and stiff onto her lap. A glove. She blinked at it, half laughing through disbelief. "Evidence, huh? You must be Merrick's dog." Then she noticed the small metal tube clipped to his collar. She unscrewed it with shaking fingers and read the message inside. The handwriting was firm, precise. "Stay put. Help coming. J.M." She looked down at Kaiser, who stood motionless, waiting. "Well," she said, breath trembling, "guess you and I are partners tonight." She reached into the glove compartment, pulled out a thermal blanket, and wrapped it loosely around her shoulders, then grabbed a strip of jerky from her pocket. "Payment in advance," she muttered, breaking it in half. Kaiser accepted it politely before turning toward the storm again, glancing back once as if to say, "Follow the note." Elena watched as he disappeared once more, swallowed by the endless white, his tail vanishing last like a signature written by the wind. Back at the observatory, Jonah paced near the radio. The minutes dragged, each one louder than the next. The blizzard battered the dome, its howls echoing like artillery. He tuned through channels, desperate for any sign of life. Then, faintly, the speaker crackled. "This is Sheriff Ward. I've received your message. The dog made contact." Jonah exhaled a laugh of relief, the sound breaking the tension in his chest. "Copy that, Sheriff. Hold your position. Keep your engine off. Conserve fuel. I'll guide you when the storm eases." But the storm did not ease. Instead, it grew, the wind rising in pitch until it sounded like voices, hundreds of them whispering through the static. Jonah rubbed his temple, fatigue blurring the edges of his focus. Kaiser was still out there somewhere, fighting his way back home. He reached into his pocket, pulled out the old compass he'd carried since his service days, its needle trembling wildly. "Find him, Lord," he muttered, setting it beside the map of the hill. Hours passed before a faint scratching at the steel door stirred him from his trance. Jonah swung it open, and there he was, Kaiser coated in frost, one paw bleeding from the ice but eyes bright and steady. The old man dropped to one knee and pulled him close. "You did it, boy," he whispered, voice thick. "You found her." Kaiser licked his glove, then rested his head against Jonah's chest, tail thumping weakly. As the storm raged outside, the two remained by the generator's glow. The man and his dog, one the voice, one the messenger, standing between a dying town and the silence waiting to claim it. The wind had not eased since nightfall. It screamed over the hills like 1,000 sirens, shaking the windows of every house still standing. At the base of Frost Hill, the sheriff's plow was now a white mound, half buried by snow, its yellow light dim and flickering. Inside the cab, Sheriff Elena Ward rubbed her numb hands together, her breath fogging the glass. Kaiser, the German shepherd, sat in the passenger seat beside her, his fur rimmed with frost but his eyes bright and unwavering. His body radiated a steady heat, a small living defiance against the storm. The note from Jonah Merrick lay open on her lap, its ink slightly smudged but still legible. "Stay put. Help coming." But Elena had never been good at waiting. She leaned forward, tried the ignition again. Nothing. The engine gave a hollow groan and died. She swore under her breath, then turned toward the dog. "All right, soldier," she murmured, half a smile tugging at her lips. "Let's make this count." She reached into the back seat for her portable radio kit, a relic she'd kept since her early days in search and rescue, and began to piece together a makeshift relay. Kaiser watched her every move, occasionally tilting his head as if supervising. "Don't give me that look," she said, clipping the last wire in place. "You'd be surprised what a stubborn woman with duct tape can manage." The radio crackled faintly when she powered it on. Static filled the cab like the hiss of a living thing. She adjusted the gain, tapping the side of the receiver, and called out, "Frost Hill Station, this is Sheriff Ward. Merrick, do you copy?" For a moment, there was nothing but the endless storm. Then a low hum broke through, followed by a calm, gravel-lined voice. "Copy that, Sheriff. You're coming in weak but clear." Elena let out a shaky laugh of relief. "About time you picked up, old man." "Good to hear your voice," Jonah replied, his tone steady, almost clinical. "Status?" She swallowed, glanced toward the snow-thickened windshield. "Engine's dead. I'm stuck about 200 meters below the ridge. Visibility's 0, but we're alive. The dog got through." "That's my boy," Jonah said quietly, and Elena could almost hear the faint smile in his voice. She reached for her notebook. "Jonah, we've got a kid, 9 years old, severe asthma, no medication left. Dr. Hale's with him, but the clinic's dead. We need medevac or he won't make it through the night." Jonah's reply was immediate, calm like an anchor in chaos. Understood. Give me the coordinates. Elena read them out, her gloved hands trembling slightly as she held the paper. On the other end, Jonah's fingers moved with mechanical precision across the dials of his transceiver, adjusting frequencies, aligning the antenna array. Sparks flared as he rerouted power from the heating system to the radio. The observatory temperature dropped fast. His breath fogged the air, like ghostly smoke. Kaiser's ears twitched, sensing the shift in tone, as if he could hear the invisible thread of communication tightening between the two humans who now depended on each other completely. Jonah's voice, now steady through the interference, came through her radio again. Coordinates received. I'm patching through to the Federal Emergency Band. She heard the faint hum of switching channels, the buzz of frequencies being tuned. Sheriff, what's the boy's vitals? Elena hesitated. Dr. Hale said his oxygen levels were dropping below 90 before they lost power. He's slipping fast. Copy, Jonah said, and his tone hardened with command. Sheriff, stay put. You'll serve as my relay. I'm going to raise Nightingale command of the National Guard. Back in the observatory, Jonah's hands moved like a pianist across his console. The storm outside sounded like artillery, each gust a percussion of memory. The faint light from the generator cast bronze shadows across his face, revealing the fine lines of discipline and exhaustion. He pressed the transmitter key. This is Civilian Emergency Station Frost Hill, Coldwater County, calling Nightingale Search Command. Priority 1, child in respiratory failure. Medevac required, over. Static answered first. Then a burst of distorted chatter broke through. Frost Hill, this is Nightingale Command. We read you faintly. Repeat coordinates. Jonah repeated them clearly, his voice unwavering. He could feel the pulse of the storm in the floor beneath him, but his focus didn't falter. Designate landing zone, came the faint voice. Jonah's eyes flicked to the topographical map pinned to his wall. The observatory roof couldn't withstand rotor wash, but the high school's football field, wide and open, could. Landing zone will be Coldwater High School Athletic Field. Coordinates transmitting now. Approach vector east by southeast. Advise minimal elevation due to wind shear. He switched frequencies, cross-checked the signal strength, and hit transmit again. Sheriff Ward, this is Merrick. We've got Nightingale on standby. They'll need ground flare confirmation. You'll have to reach the high school. Elena's throat tightened. Jonah, the roads are gone. The drifts are 6 feet deep. Then dig or crawl, Jonah replied gently but firmly. You've got that dog with you, don't you? He'll find the way. She stared at Kaiser, who was already watching her, head cocked, as if waiting for the next order. You hear that? She said softly. You're promoted, Captain. The dog wagged his tail once, a flash of determination in the storm's dim light. Meanwhile, across town, inside his darkened lumber shop, Rick Dalton stood by the window, staring into the void where the observatory's faint light still flickered. The wind had silenced the town's usual noises. Even the neon sign outside his store had gone dark. For hours, he had mocked the storm, but now the silence pressed down on him like guilt. Through the wall, he could hear the battery-powered radio he'd left running behind the counter. Jonah's voice came through faintly, calm, commanding, unbothered by the chaos. Wind velocity at 50 knots. Nightingale, adjust descent angle 10 degrees west. Maintain altitude until visual of flare. Rick froze. That voice. It wasn't the muttering of an old hermit. It was the voice of a soldier, precise and disciplined. He stepped closer, his breath catching as he listened. Jonah spoke again, coordinating with the guard as though he'd never left the field. Copy that, Nightingale. ETA 5 minutes. Sheriff Ward will signal from ground level. Rick's stomach twisted. He thought of the flyers he'd passed out, the lies he'd told. His reflection in the window looked pale, ashamed. Christ, he muttered, rubbing his beard. We were wrong about him. At the observatory, Jonah leaned into the mic once more. Sheriff, confirm flare readiness. Copy, Elena replied, her breath sharp from cold. I'm at the high school, setting signal now. She struck a flare, its red flame cutting through the whiteout like blood against snow. The smoke curled violently in the wind, a scar of color in an otherwise dead world. Jonah watched through his window as a faint red pulse glimmered in the valley below. He smiled faintly. Beautiful sight, Sheriff. Hold it steady. Moments later, the roar of rotor blades tore through the storm. Nightingale's searchlight pierced the clouds, sweeping over the town like the eye of heaven itself. Nightingale to Frost Hill. Visual confirmed. Beginning descent. Jonah exhaled, sagging back into his chair. For a long moment, he simply listened to the radio chatter, the clipped confirmations, the ordered chaos of trained men and women doing what needed to be done. When at last he heard the words, "Child secured, lifting off," he closed his eyes. Kaiser, now dry and warm again, rested beside him, his head on Jonah's boot. The storm still raged, but above its howling came a new sound, the rhythmic thump of helicopter blades fading toward the horizon. And in the lumber shop, Rick Dalton stood frozen beside his silent radio, the heat of shame burning in his chest. He whispered to himself, "That old man just saved this town." The storm that had devoured Coldwater began to lose its voice at dawn. What had been a roaring monster through the night now muttered like an exhausted god, wind dragging across the hills in long, tired sighs. The sky was still gray, but in its depths there was a faint trace of silver, the color of endurance. On the valley floor, the Nightingale helicopter hovered over the school's football field, its rotor blades slicing the air into frantic ribbons. Snow whipped into a halo around it, reflecting red from the signal flares that still burned in the corners of the field. Dr. Miriam Hale stumbled forward, clutching her son Noah close against her chest. She was nearly unrecognizable beneath the frost, her auburn hair soaked and clinging to her face, her skin pale with exhaustion and grief that hadn't yet become relief. Her lips were cracked, her eyes swollen red, but she held the boy with the strength of a mother who'd already decided she would not bury her child tonight. Noah's small hands were limp, his breathing shallow but steady enough for her to whisper, "You're okay, sweetheart. You're okay." The medics from Nightingale rushed toward her, two figures in dark uniforms and reflective goggles, their movements sharp, rehearsed. One of them, Lieutenant Avery Locke, took the boy gently from her arms. Avery was a man in his mid-30s, tall and broad-shouldered, with a trimmed black beard and the solid, unflappable calm of someone who had spent years rescuing people from chaos. His partner, Sergeant Dana Ruiz, a lean woman with olive skin and a scar tracing her left cheekbone, adjusted the oxygen mask over Noah's face, her eyes narrowing in quick clinical focus. "Pulse weak but present," she called over the roar of the blades. Avery nodded, securing the boy to the stretcher. "We've got him. Ma'am, we'll take it from here." Miriam, trembling, nodded wordlessly and let her hands fall to her sides as they lifted Noah onto the aircraft. The helicopter rose slowly, fighting the remnants of the storm. Snow whirled beneath it like ghosts being exorcised. Elena Ward stood nearby, one hand shielding her face from the downwash. Her coat snapped like a flag in the wind, her dark braid whipping across her shoulder. When the aircraft cleared the treetops, she exhaled a long breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. The sound of the blades faded into the horizon, leaving only the wind's tired sigh. Coldwater was silent again, its streets buried under white waves. High above, at the crest of Frost Hill, Jonah Merrick stood outside the observatory, his eyes following the helicopter until it vanished into the gray. His face was streaked with windburn, his beard stiff with frost. He had done it. Held the line when every other signal had gone dead. But the victory brought no warmth. When the sound finally faded, he turned toward the door, expecting to see Kaiser at his heel. There was only the wind. Kaiser? How called. The name vanished into the snow. His stomach dropped. Kaiser! He turned full circle, scanning the drifts, his breath quickening. He replayed the night's events in his head, sending the dog out with the message tube, waiting for word from the sheriff, the final radio transmission from Nightingale, and realized he hadn't seen Kaiser return after the flare. He ran back inside, grabbed his coat and flashlight, and plunged into the storm. The snow was waist-deep in places, the landscape unrecognizable. The once familiar trees along the ridge were bowed under the weight of ice, their branches like skeletal arms. Jonah's boots crunched over crusted snow that cracked and caved beneath him. Each time he called, the sound came back wrong, muted, swallowed by the endless white. "Come on, boy," he rasped, voice hoarse. "Don't make me chase you now." The cold gnawed through his gloves, biting at his fingers until they burned. His flashlight beam cut through the gray, revealing nothing but drifting snow and shattered branches. He kept moving, slower now, each step heavier. The old wound in his knee throbbed like a heartbeat. He stumbled once, caught himself on a half-buried boulder, and laughed bitterly. "Old fool," he muttered. "He's smarter than you." Still, he pressed on. Minutes bled into hours, or so it felt. The world had no time here, only motion and fatigue. Then, just as despair began to creep in like frost under the skin, something stirred at the edge of his vision, a faint, dark speck moving against the endless white. Jonah froze, squinting. The speck wavered, then grew, resolving into shape. A dog. Kaiser. The German shepherd was limping, his front leg dragging slightly, his coat heavy with ice, but his tail wagged weakly as he trudged forward. Jonah's throat closed. He stumbled toward him, half falling through the snow until he reached the animal. "You stubborn son of a gun," he whispered, dropping to his knees. Kaiser pressed his muzzle against Jonah's chest, panting shallowly, eyes still bright despite exhaustion. His fur was torn near the shoulder, probably from ice or debris, but his spirit, that flame Jonah had come to depend on, still burned steady. Jonah wrapped his arms around him, feeling the dog's heartbeat against his chest, strong and real. For a long time, he just knelt there, his breath fogging the air between them. The wind eased slightly, and in the hush that followed, Jonah realized he was crying. It was not a soldier's cry, not the brief, shameful tears he'd allowed himself at a comrade's grave. This was deeper, older. It came from somewhere beneath words, from the part of him that had been frozen for 50 years and had finally cracked open. The tears cut hot paths down his weathered face, falling into Kaiser's fur. "You came back," he whispered. "You always do." The dog nuzzled his beard, tail brushing the snow. Jonah laughed softly, the sound breaking, into a sob. He gathered Kaiser into his arms, surprisingly light for such a strong creature, and carried him back toward the observatory. His legs ached, lungs burning, but he kept moving, each step marking a promise. The dome loomed ahead, half buried but still standing, its surface glinting faintly with ice. By the time he reached the door, his strength was nearly gone. He leaned his shoulder against the steel, pushing it open with a grunt. Warm air from the generator-warmed room brushed his frozen skin like mercy itself. He crossed the threshold, laid Kaiser gently on the wool blanket near the fire, and collapsed beside him. For a long time, the only sound in the observatory was the faint hum of the generator and the dog's steady breathing. Jonah reached out, his hand resting on Kaiser's side, feeling it rise and fall. The storm had finally quieted, but inside the old soldier, another storm was ending too. The one that had raged since the war, since loss had taught him to love nothing too deeply. Tonight, that rule had broken. He sat back against the wall, staring at the faint glow of dawn through the frost-laced window. 50 years, he whispered, and you're the first thing I couldn't lose. Kaiser stirred, lifting his head, eyes half open. Jonah smiled. Rest now, partner. You've earned it. Outside, the wind died completely. The observatory stood like a monument in the white silence, its rusted dome catching the first fragile light of morning. Inside, by the dying fire, the man who once commanded soldiers and the dog who had just saved a town slept side by side, two survivors at peace beneath the endless cold sky. The storm left Coldwater in silence, an exhausted hush that clung to the mountains like breath after prayer. The morning light spread across the valley, thin and colorless at first, revealing a town half buried yet miraculously intact. Icicles hung from power lines like frozen tears, and rooftops sagged under the weight of snow, but the smoke rising from a few chimneys proved one thing. The people had endured. Up on Frost Hill, the old observatory stood like a survivor of another world. Its dome, half rusted and rimmed with frost, caught the first rays of sunlight. From a distance, it looked like an ancient sentinel keeping watch. Inside, Jonah Merrick stirred from his chair near the fire, his shoulders hunched beneath a wool blanket. Beside him lay Kaiser, bandaged and half asleep, his chest rising and falling with a slow, contented rhythm. Jonah's hands were rough and blistered, his beard heavy with white, but his eyes were alive again. He sipped cold coffee from a metal mug and stared at the quiet radio console that had, for one long night, carried the lifeline of a town. The thought made him smile faintly. "Guess you still got it, old man," he muttered to himself. Kaiser's tail gave a lazy thump in reply. By midday, movement broke the monotony of the snowbound slope. 3 figures were making their way up the hill, following the half-frozen trail that led to the observatory. The first was Sheriff Elena Ward, trudging forward with the slow, sure pace of someone who had walked through worse. Her parka was streaked with frost, her braid tucked under her fur-lined hood, and though fatigue shadowed her face, her gray-blue eyes still held that quiet determination that people in Coldwater had come to rely on. Behind her climbed Dr. Miriam Hale, her auburn hair braided loosely, her cheeks flushed from the cold. She carried a thermos in one hand and a small duffel bag slung over her shoulder. Medical supplies, mostly. There was new light in her face, the kind that only mothers who have seen death retreat from their doorstep can hold. The last man, lagging slightly behind, was Rick Dalton. The lumber shop owner looked older than his 45 years that morning. His broad frame, usually upright and swaggering, seemed smaller now under the gray coat, and guilt that hung from him like an extra weight. His beard was unkempt, his eyes downcast, and every step he took seemed an apology waiting for words. When the trio reached the observatory, Jonah was already outside waiting, one gloved hand resting on the metal railing, the other raised in greeting. "Didn't think I'd see visitors this soon," he said, his voice rough but warm. Elena smiled faintly. "We thought we'd check if the town's newest hero was still alive." Jonah chuckled. "Hero's a big word for a man who mostly yells at machines." His gaze shifted to Rick, who stood a few paces behind, fidgeting. Rick's lips parted, but for a moment no words came. Finally, he said, voice low, I was wrong about you, Merrick. About all of this. He gestured at the dome, the hill, the horizon. We all were. I said things I shouldn't have. Passed around rumors that, hell, they stuck. And I'm sorry. Jonah studied him for a long moment. Rick's apology wasn't smooth. It trembled like something that had taken too long to leave a man's chest. Jonah nodded slowly. You showed up, he said. That's apology enough. Elena stepped forward. The council met this morning, she began, her tone all business, though her eyes softened when she looked at him. They've agreed to cancel the demolition order on the observatory. In fact, they're proposing something else. She handed him a folded paper, official letterhead visible through the creases. Jonah opened it, reading silently. As he did, Miriam spoke. We want to turn this place into the Coldwater Emergency Communications Center. The storm proved we need a backup signal hub, something that can stay alive when everything else dies. She smiled. You already did the hard part, kept it running. Jonah looked up, his eyes glinting with quiet disbelief. You mean to tell me the same people who wanted this place flattened now want it funded? Rick gave a sheepish grin. Guess we finally realized a rusty dome's worth more than a shiny ski lodge. Elena crossed her arms, her voice gentle but firm. We'll handle the logistics. Fuel, maintenance, crew. All we need is your consent to keep doing what you do best. Jonah's gaze drifted toward Kaiser, who had hobbled to the doorway, tail wagging despite the bandage on his leg. He smiled faintly. Looks like I've got a partner who won't let me retire anyway. By afternoon, the four of them were inside, discussing repairs and wiring. The sound of conversation filled the dome for the first time in decades. Human voices, laughter, the faint hum of the generator keeping pace like a heartbeat. Miriam checked Kaiser's wound, her hands careful and steady. He's lucky, she murmured. Could have been frostbite or worse. Jonah nodded. Luck's been thin lately, but I'll take it. Rick busied himself clearing the broken instruments from one corner, his thick gloves clumsy but persistent. At one point he paused and said quietly, You ever think maybe this old place saved us before we even knew it? Jonah looked around. The tangled wires, the rusted panels, the glass panels patched with tape, and said, Maybe it was just waiting for someone to listen again. As the sun set, the valley began to glow. The sky turned from gray to amber, and the observatory's windows caught the light, spilling it across the snow like spilled honey. Elena and the others prepared to descend, but Jonah stayed by the railing, watching the town below slowly flicker to life. Generator lights, candles, the faint rhythm of recovery. Elena turned back. You coming down, Merrick? He shook his head. Not tonight. Someone's got to keep an ear on the world. She smiled. We'll send up supplies tomorrow. Then she gestured to the dog. And tell your deputy to stay out of trouble. Jonah chuckled, patting Kaiser's head. He outranks me. When they were gone, the old man returned to the radio console. He flicked a few switches. The static hummed softly, familiar and alive. Outside, darkness spread across the valley, but from the dome's single lamp spilled a warm, steady glow. It wasn't blinding like a lighthouse beam. It was humbler, kinder. A watcher's light. Jonah sat down beside Kaiser, who rested his head on his knee and whispered, You hear that, boy? It's quiet. The kind of quiet we fought for. The dog's tail tapped against the floor, a slow rhythm. Jonah's eyes lifted to the window, where the reflection of the dome light shimmered against the night. Loyalty doesn't need words, he said softly, stroking Kaiser's ear. Just hearts close enough to hear each other through the wind. And under the patient sky, the observatory glowed like a single, steadfast eye, no longer a relic of the past, but the living heartbeat of Coldwater's future. When the winds of Coldwater finally grew still, the people realized something sacred. The miracle they had prayed for didn't descend from the heavens with thunder or light. It came through a man and his dog, through the crackle of an old radio and the steady flame of loyalty that refused to die. God's hand, they understood, doesn't always move in the grand or the loud. Sometimes it whispers through the storm, in the courage to keep listening, in the kindness we give when no one is watching, and in the faith that even silence can carry a prayer. Each of us, in our own storms, has a dome to keep lit, a place where hope waits for our return. Maybe it's a home, a friendship, or a promise we once made to someone we love. And when the world around you grows cold, remember Jonah and Kaiser. Remember that God's miracles often walk on 4 legs, breathe quietly beside us, and teach us to see light where the world sees ruin. If this story touched your heart, share it to bring warmth to someone else's storm. Leave a comment, subscribe for more stories of faith and redemption, and may the Lord bless you. May His light guide your heart, keep your home safe, and remind you that miracles are never lost, only waiting to be found.